Roosevelt dispatched an emissary, Joseph Davis, who'd been his ambassador to Russia in the late 1930s, to hand-deliver the letter to Stalin. While Davis was in Moscow, Churchill was in Washington. He spent a fortnight with Roosevelt. Not once did the president breathe a word of his private approach to Stalin. On May the 26th, with Churchill safely gone, Roosevelt received a positive reply from Stalin.
As I do not know how events will develop on the Soviet-German front in June, I shall not be able to leave Moscow during that month. I therefore suggest holding the meeting in July or August.
But Roosevelt's secret plan was about to hit a snag. He and Churchill had decided to postpone the invasion of France to 1944. They believed British and American forces were still not strong enough to beat the German defenses. Stalin responded angrily to his allies' delay.
The Soviet government cannot align itself with this decision, which was adopted without its participation.
Churchill was worried by Stalin's hostile reaction. And by now he had also got wind of Roosevelt's secret letter. He tried to flush Roosevelt out.
All this makes me anxious to know anything you may care to tell me about your letter sent to Stalin by Mr. Davis, and the answer which has been received from him. I will, of course, come anywhere you wish to a rendezvous.
Churchill still had no inkling he was to be excluded. Finally, Roosevelt came clean. On June the 24th, his special envoy in London, Averell Harriman, went to Downing Street and told Churchill what had been going on. Churchill was shattered. He rang his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden.
Went round to see Winston at midnight at his request. Found him considerably upset by a message from FDR that his projected meeting will be à deux.
Churchill not only felt personally betrayed, he could also sense the blow to British power. And he could see that Roosevelt, in trying to hijack the relationship with Stalin, was taking the first steps to an American-Russian partnership which would determine the future world. The next day, controlling his emotions as best he could, he wrote one of the most important letters of his life.
Former naval person to President, personal and secret. Averell told me last night of your wish for a meeting with Uncle Joe in Alaska à deux. You must excuse me expressing myself with all the frankness that our friendship and the gravity of the issue warrant. I do not underrate the use that enemy propaganda would make of a meeting between the heads of Soviet Russia and the United States at this juncture, with the British Commonwealth and Empire excluded. It would be serious and vexatious, and many would be bewildered and alarmed thereby. Nevertheless, whatever you decide, I shall sustain to the best of my ability here.
Churchill had been kept in the dark for 6 full weeks by the ally he thought to be his friend. 4 days later, Roosevelt replied with a flat lie.
I did not suggest to Uncle Joe that we meet alone, but he told Davies that he assumed A, that we would meet alone, and B, that he agreed that we should not bring staffs to what would be a preliminary meeting.
In August, Stalin finally turned down Roosevelt's request for a meeting, claiming the pressures of war as his excuse. For the moment, Roosevelt was thwarted. Beyond the deceit and the power play, the distressing episode left Churchill with a further troubling thought. Up until now, both he and Roosevelt had handled Stalin with kid gloves. But Churchill was becoming split-minded. On one side, he believed that he, as one great man, could deal with Stalin, another great man, by face-to-face diplomacy. But on the other side, The Katyn massacre had reawakened all his old fears of the Bolsheviks. A nightmare was forming, that Stalin was at the head of a Russian colossus, which would devour much of Europe before the British and Americans could get there, and create a new, totalitarian empire. Churchill had long feared that a cross-channel invasion against the heavily defended French coast would bring dreadful carnage. Instead, he favoured his alternative strategy of attacking Germany via the Adriatic and the Balkans. By the autumn of 1943, the British and Americans had landed in southern Italy. Churchill's vision seemed to him possible. But Stalin had sent angry cables, demanding that the Allies concentrate only on the invasion of France. Roosevelt's special envoy in Britain, Averell Harriman, reported to the president.
Churchill's only explanation is that Stalin wants us to become involved in Western Europe to avoid our entry in the Balkans.
Churchill was accusing Stalin of trying to use military arguments to further his political purpose of controlling Eastern Europe and the Balkans after the war. Later, in his memoirs, Churchill denied that at that stage, when Hitler was still far from beaten, he too tried to bend Allied military strategy to his political purposes. In Churchill's case, to keep Stalin out of Eastern Europe and protect British interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. But there is evidence that Churchill was being less than frank about his motives in the crucial last few months of 1943. In August 1943, the British and Americans met at Quebec to decide the next stage in the war. Churchill knew it would be fatal to suggest to Roosevelt that they should try to beat the Russians to the Balkans and Eastern Europe for political reasons. To Roosevelt, that would smack of the European imperialism he loathed. So Churchill argued for his alternative strategy on purely military grounds. But one chance remark revealed his inner thoughts.
Stalin is an unnatural man. There will be grave troubles.
At Quebec, Churchill reluctantly agreed to the American view that preparations for the invasion of France should take precedence over his alternative strategy. But back in London, Churchill began to renege. Further evidence of his political motives emerged at an extraordinary War Cabinet meeting in early October. The Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, gave an account of what happened to Oliver Harvey, his private secretary.
The PM spoke for 3 hours. He talked great nonsense, and AE was furious. The PM kept saying such things as, "We mustn't weaken Germany too much. We may need her against Russia." The cabinet colleagues were horrified at all this.
Churchill's remarks showed that Stalin's suspicions of 12 months before had not been so outlandish. Churchill now sanctioned a British operation against the island of Rhodes. Capturing Rhodes was a vital stepping stone in his alternative strategy. He hoped that it would bring Turkey into the war, providing an easy gateway to Eastern Europe.